How dare you ruin my evening? You are a disgrace. Get out of my sight and off my estate immediately.
Please, I didn't mean to. I'm so sorry.
She should be fired immediately.
The crystal champagne flute shattered against the marble floor of the grand ballroom at the Ashford estate in Newport, Rhode Island, and every conversation among the 200 guests in their designer gowns and tailored tuxedos stopped mid-sentence as all eyes turned to witness the most spectacular public humiliation anyone in that room would ever see. Standing in the center of a spreading pool of champagne and glittering glass shards was a young woman in a simple black housekeeping uniform with her dark hair pulled back in a tight bun, her face burning with shame as she stared at the floor. And looming over her with a face twisted in theatrical rage was Harrison Ashford III, the 62-year-old master of the estate. His silver hair perfectly styled, and his custom Armani tuxedo without a single wrinkle as he shouted loud enough for the entire ballroom to hear that this was exactly why people like her would never amount to anything, why they were born to serve and nothing more, why their kind would always be beneath people who mattered. His voice echoed off the vaulted ceilings decorated with Renaissance-style frescoes that his great-grandfather had commissioned from Italian artists in 1924, bounced off the walls hung with priceless artwork including 2 original Monets and a Rembrandt, and seemed to grow louder with each insult as he gestured wildly at the young woman whose hands were trembling as she bent down to start picking up the broken glass with her bare fingers, even as tears began streaming down her face. Harrison's wife, Margaret, stood beside him in a silver Dior gown that cost more than most people's cars, her surgically enhanced face arranged in an expression of aristocratic disgust as she stepped back from the mess like it was sewage. And their son, Harrison IV, a smug 35-year-old investment banker from Manhattan who had flown in for the party, actually laughed and said something to his girlfriend about the help being so incompetent these days that you couldn't leave them alone for 5 minutes without them destroying something. The young maid, whose name was Claire Bennett, looked up for just a moment with eyes that were an unusual shade of green, almost emerald, and in that brief glance there was something that didn't quite match the submissive posture and the cheap uniform and the obvious poverty that Harrison was loudly mocking, something that flickered behind those tears like a flame behind glass. But it was gone so quickly that no one in that room full of Connecticut hedge fund managers and Boston old money and New York society people noticed anything except another servant being put in her place. What Harrison Ashford III didn't know as he continued his tirade, demanding that Claire be fired immediately and removed from his property, and never allowed to work in any respectable household in Newport ever again, was that the letter sitting in Claire's small attic bedroom in the servants' quarters of his estate would destroy everything he had spent his entire life building. He didn't know that in exactly 48 hours, his family's 200-year legacy would be reduced to headlines and bankruptcy filings and federal investigations. He didn't know that the frightened young woman picking up broken glass at his feet, while 200 of the most powerful people in New England watched and whispered, and some even applauded his performance, was not remotely who or what she appeared to be. And he certainly didn't know that his decision to humiliate her in front of everyone who mattered in his world would become the single most expensive mistake anyone in his family had ever made, a mistake that would cost him not $500 million, but closer to $800 million, along with his reputation, his social standing, his freedom, and everything the Ashford name had represented for 2 centuries of American aristocracy. Claire's hands were bleeding now as she gathered the glass shards, her fingers cut in several places, and Harrison noticed this and actually smiled, saying loud enough for the entire ballroom to hear that she should be more careful or she'd bleed all over his Italian marble and make an even bigger mess than she already had. And wasn't that just typical of people who came from nothing and would return to nothing? Margaret Ashford suggested in her cultured Boston Brahmin accent that perhaps they should just have security remove the girl so the party could continue, Because really, this was becoming tedious, and their guests had come to celebrate Harrison's latest business triumph, not to witness the staff's inadequacies. One of the other maids, a kind older woman named Rosa Martinez, who had worked at the estate for 15 years, tried to step forward to help Claire, but the head butler, a stern British man named Mr. Pemberton, who had been with the Ashfords for 23 years, stopped her with a sharp look that said interfering would only make things worse for everyone. So Claire continued alone, her blood mixing with the champagne on the floor, her tears falling onto the broken crystal, while Harrison launched into a speech about standards and excellence, and how the problem with America today was that people didn't understand their place anymore, didn't respect the natural order of things, didn't comprehend that some people were simply born better than others, and that's just how the world worked and always would work. The party eventually moved on because people like the ones in that ballroom were experts at moving on from uncomfortable scenes, at pretending they hadn't just witnessed cruelty and injustice, at sipping their champagne and resuming their conversations about summer houses in Martha's Vineyard and winter skiing in Aspen, and which prep schools were still worth the tuition. Claire was escorted out of the ballroom by Mr. Pemberton, who at least had the decency to look somewhat uncomfortable as he told her in a quiet voice that she should go to her room and pack her things because Mr. Ashford had made his wishes clear, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. She walked through the service corridors of the massive estate with her bleeding hands clutched to her chest, past the industrial kitchens where the catering staff pretended not to see her, up the narrow back staircase that the servants used so the family and guests would never have to encounter them, and finally into the cramped attic room that had been her home for the past 8 months. A space so small that the single bed nearly touched the dresser, and the sloped ceiling made it impossible to stand up straight on one side. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her hands, at the cuts that would need bandaging, at the blood that had dried into dark streaks, and then she looked at the envelope sitting on her dresser, the envelope that had arrived that morning in the mail, the envelope with the law firm's return address, and the news that she had been waiting 8 months to receive. Claire Bennett had come to the Ashford estate in February, applying for the housekeeping position through an agency that specialized in placing domestic staff in wealthy households, and her resume had been perfect for what she needed it to be. A young woman of 28 with no family, no connections, no education beyond high school, desperate for work and willing to accept the low wages and long hours that came with serving people like the Ashfords. She had interviewed with Mrs. Harrison Ashford in the estate's morning room, a space decorated in pale blues and creams with French doors overlooking the ocean, and she had played her role perfectly, keeping her eyes down when Margaret asked about her background, speaking softly when asked about her work ethic, showing just the right amount of gratitude when Margaret had sniffed and said that they supposed she would do and that she could start the following Monday. The other staff had been kind to her in the way that people who work in service are kind to newcomers, showing her the routines and schedules, warning her about Mr. Ashford's temper and Mrs. Ashford's impossible standards and young Harrison's wandering hands when he visited from New York, teaching her which rooms to clean when, and how everything had to be perfect because the Ashfords noticed every tiny imperfection and someone always paid the price. Rosa had taken Claire under her wing, sharing her lunch and telling her stories about the family, about how Harrison III had inherited the estate and the family shipping business, and the investment portfolios from his father, who had inherited them from his father going all the way back to the first Harrison Ashford, who had made his fortune in the whaling industry and Newport real estate in the 1820s. What Rosa and the others didn't know was that Claire had not come to the Ashford estate looking for work, but looking for evidence. Her real name was not Claire Bennett, but Catherine Elizabeth Hartwell, and she was not a high school dropout with no prospects, but a graduate of Yale Law School with honors, and 3 years of experience at the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York, specializing in financial crimes and fraud. She had not stumbled into the housekeeping position by accident, but had engineered it carefully after 14 months of investigation, had revealed that the Ashford family's vast fortune was not built on generations of legitimate business success, as everyone believed, but on one of the most sophisticated fraud schemes that Catherine and her colleagues had ever encountered. A scheme that involved shell companies and offshore accounts and falsified shipping records and tax evasion and money laundering that connected the Ashfords to criminal enterprises spanning 3 continents. The investigation had started with a seemingly unrelated case involving a shipping container that had arrived at the port of Newark, containing not the luxury automotive parts listed on the manifest, but $2 million worth of stolen electronics. And when the investigators had traced the ownership of the shell company that had arranged the shipment, they had found another shell company, and another, and another, and eventually all roads had led to a quiet investment firm in Newport, Rhode Island, that was wholly owned by Harrison Ashford III. But having suspicions and having evidence that would stand up in federal court were 2 entirely different things, and the Ashfords were protected by layers of lawyers and accountants and corporate structures that had been designed specifically to be impenetrable. Catherine and her team at the U.S. Attorney's Office had tried every conventional investigative technique, subpoenaed records, interviewed employees, followed money trails, but the Ashfords were too careful, too well insulated, and every time the investigation seemed to be getting somewhere, it would hit a wall of legal objections and jurisdictional complications and records that had mysteriously been destroyed in accordance with document retention policies. Then Catherine's supervisor, a brilliant prosecutor named James Morrison, who had spent 20 years bringing down white-collar criminals, had suggested something unconventional, something that walked right up to the edge of what was legally and ethically permissible. He had said that the only way to get inside the Ashford operation was to literally get inside, to have someone on the ground in the estate where Harrison and Margaret conducted much of their business from home offices, where documents might be less carefully secured than at their corporate headquarters, where conversations might be overheard and patterns might be observed, and the kind of evidence that couldn't be subpoenaed might be accessible to someone who was invisible to people who never really looked at their servants. Catherine had volunteered immediately, despite the risks, despite the knowledge that if the Ashfords discovered who she really was before she found what she needed, the entire investigation could collapse and charges might never be filed. She had spent 2 months preparing, creating an entirely fictional background complete with false employment records and references that would check out if anyone bothered to verify them, studying how to play the role of someone from a completely different social class, learning to make herself invisible in the way that domestic workers become invisible to wealthy people who see them as part of the furniture rather than as human beings. Her colleagues had worried that she couldn't pull it off, that someone would recognize her despite the changed hair color and the lack of makeup and the dowdy uniforms. But Catherine had understood something that they didn't, which was that people like the Ashfords didn't really see people like the Maid they thought she was, that the invisibility was built into the class difference itself, that as long as she kept her head down and her voice quiet and her presence unobtrusive, she could move through their world like a ghost gathering secrets. The first few months at the estate had been harder than Catherine had anticipated, not because the work was physically demanding, though it certainly was, but because of the casual cruelty that people like the Ashfords inflicted on people they considered beneath them. She had cleaned their bathrooms and made their beds and served their meals while they talked about her as if she wasn't there, discussing whether she was pretty enough to look at or too plain, whether she seemed smart enough to follow instructions or too stupid to bother explaining things to, whether she might steal from them and should be watched carefully because you never could tell with people from her background. She had bitten her tongue 1,000 times, had swallowed her pride and her anger, had reminded herself that every insult and humiliation was temporary, that she was gathering the ammunition that would eventually bring their entire world crashing down. And she had found things, small things at first, documents left in Harrison's home office that she photographed with the tiny camera disguised as a button on her uniform, conversations she overheard and recorded on the digital device hidden in her cleaning supply cart, emails that Harrison printed out and left in his trash, thinking that shredding was only necessary at the corporate office. Not at home, where the only people who ever saw his garbage were servants, who couldn't possibly understand what they were looking at anyway. Piece by piece, Catherine had built her case, transmitting information to James Morrison through a secure system that involved dead drops and encrypted communications, never risking direct contact that might be observed or traced. She had documented shipping schedules that didn't match official records, payments to shell companies that existed only on paper, conversations about business deals that were never reported to tax authorities, and slowly the pattern had become clear. The Ashford family had been systematically defrauding the government, their business partners, and their investors for at least 3 generations, creating false tax losses to avoid paying hundreds of millions in taxes, inflating the value of their assets to secure loans they had no intention of repaying legitimately, using their shipping business as a front for moving illegal goods that ranged from stolen property to counterfeit luxury items to substances that Catherine's colleagues in other divisions of the Justice Department were very interested in. The scheme was brilliant in its complexity and breathtaking in its scope, and if Catherine and her team could prove even half of what they suspected, the Ashfords would be facing criminal charges that could send Harrison III to federal prison for the rest of his life. But the most damning piece of evidence, the document that would tie everything together and make the case unbeatable, had eluded Catherine for months. James Morrison had told her that they needed proof of Harrison's knowledge and intent, something that showed he wasn't just a careless businessman but a deliberate criminal, and that document existed. Catherine was sure of it, somewhere in the estate, but she hadn't been able to find it despite searching every room she had access to during her cleaning duties. Then 3 weeks ago, she had been dusting the library, a 2-story room lined with first edition books that the Ashfords had never read and probably never would, when she had noticed Harrison and a man she didn't recognize having an intense conversation in the corner near the French doors that led to the garden. She had continued dusting, invisible as always, and the recording device in her cart had captured every word as Harrison and the other man, who turned out to be the CFO of Ashford International Holdings, had discussed a new scheme involving falsified import documents and bribes to customs officials, and something about a shipment arriving at the port of Boston in 2 weeks that would generate a $10 million profit that would be run through their usual offshore accounts and never reported to any authorities. Catherine had transmitted that recording to James Morrison, and within 48 hours, a federal judge had issued warrants for both Harrison Ashford III and his CFO, as well as search warrants for the estate, the corporate offices, and half a dozen other properties and businesses connected to the Ashford family. But James had called off the immediate execution of those warrants because Catherine had mentioned in her report that during the conversation, Harrison had referred to something called the Master Ledger, a document that apparently contained records of every fraudulent transaction the family had engaged in for the past 30 years, maintained as a kind of insurance policy in case anyone in the organization ever tried to turn against them. James had said that if they could get that ledger before arresting Harrison, the case would go from strong to absolutely ironclad. So Catherine had been given 2 more weeks to find it, and she had searched everywhere, had taken risks that made her nervous, had stayed late in offices she wasn't supposed to be in and looked through files she had no legitimate reason to access. And then, 8 days ago, she had found it, not in Harrison's office or his private study, but in Margaret's dressing room. Hidden in a false bottom of an antique wardrobe, a leather-bound ledger that looked like it might be some kind of family journal, but was actually a meticulous record of every crime the Ashfords had committed in the pursuit of maintaining and growing their fortune. Catherine had photographed every page, 347 pages in total, working through the night while the family slept, and she had transmitted the final images to James Morrison just as the sun was rising over the Atlantic Ocean, visible from the servants' attic windows. James had called the coded number that would ring in Catherine's room during her designated off hours, and his voice had been shaking with excitement as he told her that she had done it, that this was the most comprehensive evidence of white-collar crime he had seen in his entire career, that the grand jury would indict within days and the arrests would follow immediately. He had told her that a letter was being sent to her cover address, confirming that her family matter had been resolved favorably, and that she should prepare to leave the estate as soon as she received it, because once the warrants were executed, her cover would be blown, and there might be safety concerns if anyone in the Ashford organization figured out who had been feeding information to the feds. Catherine had been waiting for that letter, checking the small amount of mail that came to her assumed name at the estate, and it had finally arrived that morning, just hours before the charity gala that Harrison was hosting to celebrate the opening of a new wing at Newport Hospital that would bear the Ashford name in recognition of their $10 million donation, a donation that Catherine now knew had been funded with money that should have gone to the IRS in taxes. She had been planning to slip away during the party, to pack her few belongings and leave a simple resignation note and disappear before anyone noticed she was gone, returning to her real life and her real name, and watching from a safe distance as the Ashfords' world collapsed. But Harrison had demanded that all household staff be available during the gala to serve and clean and maintain the perfect appearance that was so important to people like him. And Catherine had been assigned to circulate through the ballroom with a tray of champagne flutes, refreshing glasses, and cleaning up any small spills or messes, remaining invisible while surrounded by more wealth than most people would see in a lifetime. She had been doing exactly that, moving through the crowd with her tray, when one of the guests, a drunk hedge fund manager from Greenwich, had bumped into her and sent the entire tray of champagne flutes crashing to the floor, and Harrison had immediately appeared, furious not because his guest was intoxicated and clumsy, but because his maid had failed to prevent the collision, and the humiliation had begun. Now, sitting in her attic room with her bleeding hands and her shattered dignity, and her letter confirming that the nightmare was almost over, Catherine allowed herself to feel the anger that she had been suppressing for 8 months. She thought about every insult, every dismissive comment, every moment when Harrison and Margaret and their spoiled son had treated her like she was less than human, and she permitted herself a small smile because, in less than 48 hours, they would know exactly who she really was and what she had done to them. She carefully cleaned and bandaged her cuts using the first aid kit she kept in her small bathroom, changed out of her uniform into jeans and a sweater, and began packing her belongings, which didn't take long because she had deliberately brought very little to the estate, nothing that would be difficult to carry away when the time came. She could hear the party continuing several floors below, the sound of music and laughter and glasses clinking in toasts to Harrison's generosity and success, and she wondered what those same people would be saying in a few days when the news broke that their host was being arrested on federal charges. The knock on her door came around midnight, after the party had ended, and the guests had departed in their Mercedes and BMWs and Teslas, driving back to their own mansions and penthouse apartments. Catherine opened it to find Rosa standing there with a worried expression, carrying a small bag with medical supplies and some cookies wrapped in a napkin. Rosa came in without asking and immediately took Catherine's hands to inspect the bandages, making sympathetic noises about how terrible the whole thing had been, How unfair Mr. Ashford had been even by his own impossible standards. How sorry she was that Catherine was being fired because she had been a good worker and a kind person, and didn't deserve what had happened. Catherine felt a pang of guilt because Rosa had been genuinely kind to her, had shared her lunch and her stories and her friendship. And Rosa had no idea that everything about their relationship had been based on a lie, that the young woman she thought she knew didn't really exist. Rosa said that she had spoken to her sister who worked at another estate in Newport, and they might have a position opening up in a few weeks if Catherine needed a reference. And Catherine had to look away because the kindness was almost harder to bear than Harrison's cruelty had been. After Rosa left, Catherine lay in the narrow bed and stared at the sloped ceiling and listened to the old house settling around her, and she thought about everything that had led her to this moment. She had grown up in a middle-class family in suburban Philadelphia, her father a public school teacher and her mother a nurse, and she had been raised with a strong sense of justice and fairness that her parents had modeled in everything they did. She had watched her father fight for resources for his underfunded school, had seen her mother advocate for patients who couldn't advocate for themselves, and she had learned that the world was divided between people who used their advantages to help others and people who used them to accumulate more advantages at everyone else's expense. She had been a brilliant student, earning scholarships that made Yale possible, and she had gone to law school with the specific goal of becoming a prosecutor, of using the law to protect people who couldn't protect themselves from those who thought they were above consequences. Her parents had been so proud when she graduated, when she landed the position at the U.S. Attorney's office, and her father had told her that she was going to do important work, that she was going to make a difference, and she had believed him because she had been young and idealistic, and certain that justice would prevail if good people worked hard enough. The reality of prosecution had been more complicated than she had imagined, with cases that fell apart because of technicalities, defendants who walked free because of expensive lawyers who could exploit every loophole, victims who gave up because the system was too slow and too frustrating, and too weighted in favor of people with money and power. Catherine had won cases and lost cases, had sent some criminals to prison and watched others escape accountability, and she had learned that justice was not automatic, not guaranteed, but something that had to be fought for with intelligence and persistence, and sometimes creativity that pushed the boundaries of conventional investigation. When James Morrison had first suggested that she go undercover as domestic help, her initial reaction had been skeptical because it seemed like something from a movie rather than a serious prosecutorial strategy. But the more she had thought about it, the more she had realized it might be the only way to get inside an organization as well defended as the Ashfords, and she had committed to it fully. Understanding that 8 months of her life was a small price to pay to bring down criminals who had been stealing and defrauding and corrupting for generations. But she hadn't anticipated how personal it would become, how much the daily humiliations would wear on her sense of self, how difficult it would be to remain silent while people insulted and dismissed and dehumanized her. She was accustomed to being respected, to being the smartest person in most rooms, to being treated as a professional and an equal, and pretending to be someone with no power and no voice had required a kind of emotional discipline that was exhausting in ways she hadn't expected. There had been moments when she had almost broken character, times when Harrison had said something so outrageously classist or cruel that she had wanted to tell him exactly who she was and what was coming for him. But she had maintained her cover because that's what the job required, and because she knew that revenge was a dish best served with federal indictments and asset seizures. And now, lying in the narrow bed in the attic room on what would be her last night in the Ashford estate, Catherine allowed herself to imagine Harrison's face when the FBI agents arrived with their warrants, when he realized that his empire was built on sand and the tide was coming in. She must have fallen asleep because she woke to sunlight streaming through the small window and the sound of activity in the house below as the staff began their daily routines. Catherine, dressed in her regular clothes rather than her uniform, packed the last few items into her single suitcase and took a final look around the small room that had been her home during this strange chapter of her life. She carried her suitcase down the back stairs to the kitchen, where Rosa and several other staff members were having breakfast before beginning their work, and their faces showed surprise and confusion when they saw her dressed to leave. Mr. Pemberton appeared from the butler's pantry and asked in his formal British accent where exactly she thought she was going, and Catherine said simply that Mr. Ashford had made it clear last night that she was no longer welcome at the estate, so she was saving everyone the trouble of having to officially dismiss her. Pemberton looked uncomfortable but didn't argue, and Rosa hugged her with tears in her eyes and made Catherine promise to stay in touch, and Catherine lied and said of course she would, hating herself a little bit more with each dishonest word. She walked out through the service entrance to the circular driveway where she had arranged for a car service to pick her up, and as she stood waiting with her suitcase, she looked up at the massive Georgian mansion with its perfectly maintained facade and its ocean views and its 2 centuries of history built on exploitation and crime, and she felt no sympathy for what was about to happen to the people inside. The car arrived, a simple Toyota driven by a retired man who made extra money driving for the local service, and Catherine climbed in and gave him an address in Providence where she would be staying in a safe house until the arrests were made. And as the car pulled away from the estate, she didn't look back because she was already mentally preparing for what came next, for the trials and the testimony and the satisfaction of watching justice actually prevail for once. Her phone, which she had kept turned off for 8 months to maintain her cover, powered up as soon as she was clear of the estate grounds, and it immediately began buzzing with messages from James Morrison asking her to confirm she was out safely and to come to his office as soon as possible because things were moving faster than expected. The U.S. Attorney's office in Providence was located in a modern federal building downtown, and Catherine walked in through the main entrance for the first time in 8 months, showing her credentials to security, riding the elevator to the 7th floor, feeling like she was returning to her real life after an extended period of being someone else. James Morrison was waiting for her in his office, a corner room with views of the city and walls covered with commendations and photos from successful prosecutions, and he stood up when she entered and actually hugged her, which was unusual for him because he was normally very formal and professional. He told her that she had done incredible work, that the evidence she had gathered was even more damning than they had hoped, that the grand jury had returned indictments that morning, and that FBI agents would be executing the arrest warrants at the Ashford estate within the hour. He said that Catherine needed to prepare to testify, to explain her undercover operation and authenticate all the evidence she had gathered, and that there would be media attention, because the Ashford case was going to be one of the biggest white-collar prosecutions in New England history. Catherine asked if she could watch the arrests happen, and James pulled up a live feed on his computer because the FBI had agreed to coordinate with the U.S. Attorney's office, and they sat together watching the screen as multiple black SUVs pulled up to the Ashford estate, and agents in FBI windbreakers approached the main entrance. They saw Mr. Pemberton answer the door with his usual formality, saw his expression change to shock as he was presented with the warrant, saw him step aside as dozens of agents poured into the house. The feed switched to multiple camera angles as different teams moved through the estate, and then there was Harrison Ashford III in his morning clothes being handcuffed in his study, his face purple with rage as he shouted about his lawyers and his rights, and how this was a travesty, and someone was going to pay for this outrage. Margaret was arrested in her dressing room, her perfectly made-up face crumbling as she realized what was happening, and Harrison IV was picked up at his Manhattan apartment by a separate team, and would be transported to Providence to face charges related to his role in the family business. Catherine watched it all with a sense of satisfaction that was profound and complicated, because this was justice, this was accountability, this was everything she had worked 8 months to achieve, but it was also the destruction of lives, even if those lives had been built on the destruction of others' lives through theft and fraud and corruption. The news coverage began almost immediately, with reporters camped outside the Ashford estate and the federal courthouse, with legal experts being interviewed about the charges, with society columnists writing shocked pieces about how the distinguished Ashford family had been living a lie for generations. The charges were extensive: tax evasion, wire fraud, money laundering, bribery, conspiracy, and violations of import-export laws, with the potential prison time adding up to decades if convicted on all counts. The evidence that Catherine had gathered was summarized in the indictment, and while her name was not mentioned because she was listed only as a confidential source, people who followed these cases closely began speculating about how the government had obtained such detailed insider information. The Ashfords' lawyers, a team from one of the most expensive white shoe firms in Boston, immediately began talking about fighting the charges, claiming their clients were being persecuted by overzealous prosecutors who didn't understand complex international business. But anyone who read the indictment could see that the evidence was overwhelming, and the legal strategy seemed to be based more on hope than on any realistic assessment of the case. Catherine spent the next several weeks being debriefed, giving depositions, preparing for trial, and slowly readjusting to being herself again after 8 months of playing a role. Her colleagues at the U.S. Attorney's Office treated her like a hero, and there was talk of commendations and promotions. But Catherine found that she felt hollowed out in ways she hadn't expected, like she had left part of herself in that attic room in Newport. The therapist that the office required her to see after such an extended undercover operation told her that it was normal to experience identity confusion and emotional exhaustion after maintaining a false persona for so long, especially one that involved being subjected to regular humiliation and abuse, and that Catherine should be patient with herself as she processed the experience. But Catherine didn't want to be patient. She wanted to feel the uncomplicated satisfaction of having done good work and brought criminals to justice, and the fact that her feelings were more complex than that frustrated her in ways she couldn't fully articulate. The trial, when it finally began 6 months after the arrests, was held in federal court in Providence, and it dominated the regional news coverage because the Ashfords were such prominent figures, and the evidence was so damning, and the fall from grace was so spectacular. Catherine testified for 3 full days, explaining how she had gone undercover, what she had observed, and how she had gathered the evidence that was now being presented to the jury. The defense attorneys tried to discredit her, suggesting that her undercover operation was entrapment, that she had violated the Ashfords' privacy in illegal ways, that her testimony was unreliable because she had been playing a role and might be confused about what was real and what was performance. But Catherine was an experienced prosecutor who knew how to testify, and she calmly and methodically explained every aspect of the investigation. And when the defense lawyer asked her in an accusatory tone whether she felt any guilt about deceiving the Ashford family, she had looked directly at Harrison Ashford III sitting at the defense table and said that the only deception she felt guilty about was lying to the other household staff who had been kind to her. People like Rosa Martinez, who deserved better than to work for criminals, who paid them poverty wages with money that had been stolen from the American people. The moment that became the turning point in the trial, the moment when even the most skeptical observers knew the Ashfords were finished, came during the prosecution's presentation of the master ledger. James Morrison had the original leather-bound book admitted into evidence, and he read from it page by page, detailing transaction after transaction, crime after crime, going back 30 years to when Harrison Ashford II had first started the schemes that his son had expanded and refined. The ledger was so detailed, so meticulous, so clearly maintained as a record of criminal activity, that there was simply no way to explain it away as innocent business records or accounting errors. The jury, composed of ordinary people from Rhode Island and Massachusetts, who would never see the kind of wealth the Ashfords had accumulated, listened with expressions that shifted from shock to disgust to anger as they realized the scope of the fraud and the amount of money that had been stolen from the government and the public. When James Morrison finished reading and held up the ledger for the jury to see, he said in a quiet voice that carried through the courtroom that this was the Ashford family legacy, not the hospital wings and the museum donations and the society galas, but this record of systematic theft and corruption spanning generations. The defense tried to mount a case based on the complexity of international business and the alleged ambiguity of tax laws, and the argument that everyone in their world did the same things and the Ashfords were being singled out unfairly. But the evidence was simply too strong, and the jury was not sympathetic to arguments about how difficult it was to properly report income when you were making hundreds of millions of dollars. The trial lasted 8 weeks, and when the jury returned after only 12 hours of deliberation with guilty verdicts on all counts for Harrison Ashford III, guilty verdicts on most counts for Margaret Ashford, and guilty verdicts on several counts for Harrison Ashford IV, there was a collective gasp in the courtroom that was followed by complete silence. Harrison III's face went blank, like his brain couldn't process what was happening, and Margaret actually fainted and had to be revived by court security, and Harrison IV started crying, real tears running down his face as he realized that his privileged life was over and prison was his future. The judge set sentencing for 2 months later, and the Ashfords were remanded into custody immediately. Their bail revoked because the judge agreed with the prosecution's argument that people with their resources and international connections were flight risks. The sentencing hearing was shorter than the trial, but no less dramatic. Harrison Ashford III, who had spent 2 months in federal detention and now looked 20 years older with gray skin and hollow eyes, was sentenced to 23 years in federal prison. Margaret Ashford received 12 years. Harrison IV received 8 years. The judge, a no-nonsense woman named Patricia Chen who had been on the federal bench for 15 years, gave a statement before pronouncing the sentences that was quoted in newspapers across the country. She said that the Ashfords represented everything that was wrong with a system that allowed the wealthy to believe they were above the law, that their crimes had stolen from every honest taxpayer in America, that their fraud had corrupted institutions and damaged the integrity of the business community, and that the sentences she was imposing reflected not just the crimes they had committed, but the betrayal of the public trust that their crimes represented. She said that perhaps in federal prison, the Ashfords would have time to reflect on the difference between actual achievement and the hollow accumulation of wealth gained through theft, and that she hoped their convictions would send a message to others who believed their privilege made them immune to consequences. The asset forfeiture that followed the criminal convictions was equally devastating to what remained of the Ashford legacy. The federal government seized the Newport estate, which was valued at $45 million, along with properties in Boston, New York, and Palm Beach. They seized the art collection, including the Monets and the Rembrandt that had hung in the ballroom where Catherine had been humiliated. They seized bank accounts and investment portfolios and the family business, which was sold to satisfy the enormous fines and back taxes that the Ashfords owed. In total, the government recovered $873 million in assets and restitution, one of the largest forfeiture amounts in the history of white-collar crime prosecution. The Ashford name, which had been synonymous with old money and social prestige in New England for 200 years, became synonymous instead with greed and corruption, and the kind of arrogance that leads powerful people to believe they can steal from society without ever facing consequences. Catherine watched the sentencing from the gallery, And when it was over and Harrison Ashford III was led away in handcuffs, she felt something settle inside her, a sense that justice had actually been served, that 8 months of her life had been worth it, that sometimes the system did work when people were willing to do the hard and uncomfortable work of holding the powerful accountable. She had submitted her resignation from the U.S. Attorney's office the week before, not because she had lost faith in prosecution, but because the undercover operation had changed her, and she needed to figure out what she wanted to do with her career and her life going forward. James Morrison had tried to convince her to stay, had told her she had a brilliant future as a prosecutor, but Catherine had explained that she needed some distance, some time to be just herself without having to play any roles or maintain any personas, and he had eventually understood and accepted her decision. 6 months after the Ashford sentencing, Catherine was living in a small apartment in Boston and working as a consultant for a nonprofit organization that helped victims of financial fraud navigate the legal system. The work was satisfying in different ways than prosecution had been, more direct, more focused on helping individuals rebuild their lives after being victimized by people like the Ashfords. She had let her hair grow out to its natural color, had started dressing the way she wanted rather than in the conservative suits that prosecutors wore, and had slowly begun to feel like she was discovering who she actually was when she wasn't defining herself by her work or her role or her mission. She didn't talk much about the Ashford case, though it came up occasionally when people Googled her name and found the news articles that had eventually identified her as the confidential source. And when people asked her about it, she usually just said that she had done her job and justice had been served, and she'd rather focus on the future than the past. But there were still nights when she thought about that moment in the ballroom, when Harrison Ashford III had stood over her shouting about her place in the world while she picked up broken glass with bleeding hands. And she wondered if he ever thought about it now from his prison cell, if he ever realized that his need to humiliate someone he considered beneath him had been the catalyst for his own destruction. Because if he had just ignored the broken champagne glasses, if he had just let her clean up the mess without making a spectacle of her inadequacy, she would have slipped away that night as planned, and he would have been arrested the next day anyway. But he wouldn't have the memory of his own cruelty to haunt him. Catherine didn't believe in karma exactly, but she believed in consequences. And there was something poetic about the fact that Harrison's instinct to assert his superiority over someone he thought was powerless had become part of the public record of his trial, a detail that journalists had included in their coverage, because it perfectly illustrated the kind of person he was, the kind of arrogance and contempt that made his crimes feel personal rather than just abstract financial violations. The letter that had changed everything, the confirmation from James Morrison that the investigation was complete and the warrants were ready, had been simple and brief, just a few lines in coded language that meant nothing to anyone who might have intercepted it, but told Catherine everything she needed to know. She had kept that letter, even though she probably shouldn't have, and sometimes she took it out and looked at it and remembered the feeling of sitting in that attic room with bleeding hands, knowing that the nightmare was almost over and justice was about to be served. It reminded her why she had become a prosecutor in the first place, why she believed in the law despite all its flaws and failures, why she was willing to sacrifice 8 months of her life and subject herself to humiliation and abuse in service of holding powerful people accountable. It reminded her that she was capable of more than she sometimes believed, that she could play a role convincingly enough to fool people who thought they were experts at reading others, that she could endure disrespect and cruelty without breaking, because she understood that the temporary discomfort was in service of something larger than her own feelings. Rosa Martinez, the kind woman who had befriended Catherine at the estate, had written to her several months after the arrests, sending a letter to the U.S. Attorney's office that had been forwarded to Catherine's new address. Rosa had said that she understood now why Catherine had been there, what she had been doing, And while she wished Catherine had been able to tell her the truth, she understood why that had been impossible. She wrote that the household staff had all found new positions after the estate was seized, that most of them were working for better employers who treated them with more respect, and that in a strange way, the collapse of the Ashford family had improved their lives because they were no longer working for people who viewed them with contempt. Rosa wrote that she hoped Catherine was well, that she was proud of her for what she had done, and that if Catherine ever needed a reference for a housekeeping position, Rosa would be happy to provide one. And Catherine had laughed when she read that line because Rosa's sense of humor had always been subtle and surprising. Catherine had written back, thanking Rosa for her friendship during those difficult months, apologizing for the deception, and saying that she hoped they could stay in touch as their real selves now that the case was over. And they had, exchanging occasional emails and meeting for coffee when Catherine was in the Newport area, a genuine friendship built on the ruins of a false one. The Ashford estate itself had been sold at auction, purchased by a technology entrepreneur from California who planned to turn it into a retreat center for nonprofit organizations, a transformation that Catherine found satisfying in its symbolism. The mansion built on generations of greed being repurposed to serve the public good. The new owner had contacted Catherine through her nonprofit, saying that he wanted to name one of the conference rooms after her in recognition of her role in exposing the Ashford fraud. But Catherine had declined, saying that she didn't want to be memorialized for doing what anyone in her position should have done. She suggested instead that the room be named after Rosa Martinez and the other household workers who had labored in the estate for years, serving people who never valued their humanity. And the owner had agreed. And now there was a small plaque in what had once been the grand ballroom, identifying the space as the Martinez Room, dedicated to the dignity of labor and the essential humanity of those who serve. Catherine had been invited to speak at law schools about the Ashford case, about undercover operations and creative investigative techniques and the ethics of deception in the service of justice. And she had accepted a few of these invitations because she believed that the next generation of prosecutors needed to understand both the power and the costs of this kind of work. She told students that going undercover had been effective, but had also been emotionally damaging in ways she was still processing. That losing yourself in a role could be necessary, but was also dangerous. That they needed to think carefully about what they were willing to sacrifice in pursuit of justice, and whether the ends truly justified the means. She told them about the casual cruelty she had witnessed and experienced, about how the wealthy and powerful often treated those they considered beneath them, and about how that casual cruelty was not separate from their financial crimes, but was part of the same mindset that allowed them to steal and defraud without feeling guilt or remorse. She told them that the law was a tool that could be used for justice or for oppression depending on who wielded it and how, and that their job as prosecutors would be to make sure it was wielded on behalf of the vulnerable rather than in protection of the powerful. In her quieter moments, Catherine sometimes wondered what had happened to the person she had been before the Ashford case, before she had spent 8 months pretending to be someone powerless and invisible. She had read about undercover officers who struggled to return to their real identities after extended operations, who felt disconnected from their former selves, who carried the trauma of their assumed lives into their actual lives, and she recognized some of those symptoms in herself. She was more aware now of how she was perceived, of how she moved through the world, of the assumptions people made about her based on her appearance and demeanor. She was more sensitive to class dynamics, to the ways that wealth created blindness to the humanity of others, to how easily people could be dismissed or ignored simply because they lacked money or status or power. These weren't necessarily bad changes, but they were changes, and Catherine was still learning to integrate them into her sense of who she was and who she wanted to be. The therapist she had continued seeing after leaving the U.S. Attorney's office had told her that identity was always fluid, always evolving, and that the experience of playing a role for 8 months had simply accelerated a process that would have happened anyway as she grew and changed. Catherine wasn't entirely convinced by this argument, because there was something fundamentally different about choosing to be someone else, about deliberately constructing a false self and inhabiting it so completely that the boundaries between real and performed became blurred. But she appreciated the therapist's attempt to normalize her experience, to make her feel less like she was damaged or broken, and more like she was processing a difficult experience in the ways that human beings process difficult experiences, through time and reflection, and the slow work of making sense of what happened and what it meant. 1 year after the sentencing, Catherine was invited to a ceremony at the Department of Justice in Washington, D.C., where she was presented with a commendation for her work on the Ashford case. The Attorney General himself gave a speech about the importance of holding white-collar criminals accountable, about how crimes committed by the wealthy in boardrooms and estate offices could do as much damage as crimes committed by others on street corners, and about how Catherine Elizabeth Hartwell represented the best of what public service could be. Catherine stood on the stage in a conference room filled with prosecutors and FBI agents and Justice Department officials, and she accepted the commendation with grace and appropriate humility. And she said in her brief remarks that she had simply done her job, and that the real heroes were the victims of financial fraud who had to rebuild their lives after being devastated by criminals. And that her work at the nonprofit organization serving those victims had shown her that justice didn't end with a verdict, but required ongoing support and advocacy for those who had been harmed. After the ceremony, James Morrison took Catherine to dinner at a restaurant near the Capitol, and they talked about the case and about Catherine's new work, and about what the future might hold. James told her that she could come back to the U.S. Attorney's office whenever she wanted, that there would always be a place for a prosecutor with her skills and her dedication. But Catherine said that she was happy with her current work, that she was learning things about the legal system from the other side that she never would have understood as a prosecutor, and that maybe someday she would return to prosecution, but it wouldn't be anytime soon. James accepted this with the disappointed understanding of a mentor who had hoped to shape his protege's career, but recognized that people had to make their own choices, and they parted with mutual respect and the promise to stay in touch, and the knowledge that the Ashford case had bonded them in ways that transcended their professional relationship. Catherine took the train back to Boston that night, watching the darkness outside the window and thinking about everything that had happened in the past 2 years, and she realized that she wouldn't change any of it, not the 8 months of humiliation, not the bleeding hands in the ballroom, not even the complicated emotional aftermath, because all of it had been in service of something that mattered. She had helped bring down criminals who had stolen from the public for generations, had helped recover hundreds of millions of dollars that would go back to the Treasury and theoretically benefit all Americans, had helped send a message that white-collar crime would be prosecuted and punished just as seriously as any other kind of crime. And she had learned things about herself, about her capacity for endurance and deception and moral clarity, even in circumstances designed to blur all clarity. And those lessons would stay with her for the rest of her life and inform everything she did going forward. The Ashford family name, once synonymous with prestige and power, faded from the society pages and remained only in the legal textbooks and criminal justice courses, where the case was studied as an example of successful white-collar prosecution. Harrison Ashford III served his sentence at a federal correctional institution in Pennsylvania, and the reports that occasionally surfaced said that he had not adjusted well to prison life, that he remained bitter and angry, and convinced that he had been persecuted rather than prosecuted. Margaret Ashford was released after serving 9 years of her 12-year sentence, and she moved to a small apartment in Florida and lived on Social Security, because all of her assets had been seized, and she had no family left to support her. Her son Harrison IV having cut off all contact after his own release because he blamed her and his father for destroying his life. The estate in Newport was indeed converted into a non-profit retreat center and became a place where community organizations and advocacy groups could gather and strategize and plan their work. A transformation that seemed to Catherine like a kind of redemption for a place that had been built on exploitation and inhabited by people who believed their wealth made them superior to others. 5 years after the case concluded, Catherine was serving as the executive director of the nonprofit organization she had joined, working with a team of lawyers and advocates to help victims of financial fraud, and she had found a sense of purpose that felt more authentic than anything she had experienced as a prosecutor. She still believed in the criminal justice system despite all its flaws, still believed that prosecution was necessary and important. But she had come to understand that justice required more than just convictions and sentences, that it required support for those who had been harmed and systemic changes to prevent future harm, and a fundamental shift in how society valued different kinds of work and different kinds of people. She thought sometimes about the maid she had pretended to be, about Claire Bennett who had existed for 8 months and then disappeared, and she wondered if that character had been entirely false, or if Catherine had tapped into some real part of herself, some understanding of vulnerability and powerlessness that she carried despite her education and her position and her privileges. The question she was asked most often when she spoke about the Ashford case was whether the humiliation in the ballroom had been the hardest part of the undercover operation, and her answer was always that the hardest part had been the daily, mundane cruelty, the constant small reminders that people like the Ashfords viewed people like the maid they thought she was as less than fully human. The ballroom incident had been dramatic and public, and had made good copy for the journalists who covered the trial. But the real soul-crushing experience had been months of being invisible, of being talked about as if she wasn't there, of being dismissed and belittled and treated like her thoughts and feelings and humanity simply didn't matter because her economic status placed her in a different category of being. That was what she wanted people to understand about class in America, that it wasn't just about money, but about the way money shaped perception and humanity, about how the wealthy could convince themselves that the people who served them were fundamentally different in ways that justified indifference to their suffering. Catherine never returned to the Newport area where the Ashford estate was located, not because she was afraid or traumatized, but because she felt no need to revisit that chapter of her life, except in the service of teaching others what she had learned. She had moved on to new work and new challenges, and while the Ashford case had been the most significant thing she had done in her legal career, it was not the only thing, and she was determined that it would not define her any more than it absolutely had to. She dated occasionally, had relationships that sometimes lasted and sometimes didn't, and she was slowly building a life that felt like it belonged to her rather than to her career or her mission, or her need to prove something about justice and accountability. She stayed in touch with Rosa Martinez, who had become a genuine friend, and with James Morrison, who had become a mentor she could trust, and with a few of her former colleagues from the U.S. Attorney's Office who understood what she had sacrificed and why. The letter that had changed everything, the simple coded message that had told Catherine her work was done and justice was coming, remained in a drawer in her apartment, a reminder of a specific moment when the world had shifted and the powerful had fallen and the invisible had been seen. She didn't look at it often anymore because she didn't need to, because the memory of what she had accomplished was secure and didn't require physical evidence to remain real. But sometimes, when she was having a hard day, or when a case at the nonprofit was particularly difficult, or when she wondered whether anything she did actually mattered, she would take out the letter and read it and remember that yes, sometimes the work did matter, sometimes justice did prevail, Sometimes the right evidence at the right moment really could bring down an empire and change lives and prove that no one, no matter how wealthy or powerful or protected, was truly above the law. And in those moments, Catherine Elizabeth Hartwell, former prosecutor, former undercover operative, former maid at the Ashford estate, would smile and put the letter away and return to her work, carrying with her the knowledge that she had played a role in one of the most significant white-collar prosecutions in American history, and that while the cost had been high and the scars were real, the outcome had been worth every moment of humiliation and every drop of blood on the marble ballroom floor. Because in the end, Harrison Ashford III had been right about one thing. There were people in the world who would always be beneath others, but it turned out that those people were the ones who believed their wealth entitled them to cruelty, who thought their privilege made them immune to consequences, who had confused money with worth and power with righteousness, and who had discovered, far too late, that the young woman they had dismissed as nothing more than a servant had been the instrument of their complete and total destruction.